Hello, my name is Joshua Wagaman, and today I'm going to be doing a presentation on epistemology and a critique of skepticism. So, when we're talking about epistemology, what we're really asking is how do we know what is true? And there's two different approaches to this. The first approach is something called empiricism, and this is this idea that everything that we know is actually obtained to us by experience through our senses. So this is like things that we see, that we touch, that we hear, that we taste. And then the other idea is rationalism, which is this idea that everything that we know is actually derived through reason. And there's problems with both of these things. When it comes to empiricism, one of the main problems is that your senses can be deceived. Take, for example, on this slide, there's this very common image that you see all the time, where there are these two squares right here, A and B, that are actually the same color, but our minds fill in missing information based on what we expect. That makes them seem like they're two different colors. And these kind of illusions also happen in other places. They happen with sound, they happen with, like there's a famous example of a dress that could appear white and gold or blue and black depending on who's looking at it. There's optical illusions where you have two different images that can be perceived from the same image. But there's also other things as well that where senses can be deceived, like you might feel your phone vibrating in your pocket but actually it's nothing happening, or you might hear something when it's dark outside because your mind's playing tricks on you. But there's this other problem with senses as well, which is that the senses can be imagined. All of us have had dreams in the past, and we've heard people talk in our dreams. We might have felt things in our dreams or seen things. And the things is that none of these things are actually physical. And this also extends as far as visualization as well. Like you might see things that aren't there if you're, well, LSD and stuff like that. People who've taken hallucinogenics might have seen things. But there's also problems with rationalism, and one of the main problems is that rational statements can be made about incorrect and fictitious information. And the most obvious example of this would be the statement of all unicorns have a horn. Unicorns are fictitious, physically speaking. They don't exist. But yet we have made a rational and true statement about unicorns. And this also leads into this idea that rationalism doesn't exist unto itself in a vacuum. It is actually predicated upon empirical knowledge. And so these things really aren't incompatible with each other as much as what the material that we've covered has been saying about this. And so when we understand all of the problems with rationalism and empiricism, we're left with like a really bleak situation where like how do we even know what's real and what's not? And there's been a lot of philosophers that have done a lot of work in trying to understand this and prove what's real and what isn't. But my particular response to this is actually more in response, an argument against empiricism, beginning with the questions like, can we even know what is true? And so my arguments against skepticism are as follows. First is, as Rene Descartes would probably agree, if the word reality is to have any meaning, the self must be real. If you say that the self isn't real, then how can you really define anything as real? Because real is based on what you assume to be true for yourself. So where I kind of diverge from a lot of these different philosophers, though, is that one of the things I see as a recurring pattern is they try to say that mental experiences are unreal and that the physical experiences are real. And so there's always this battle where you're trying to like say, how do you know what's physical or what's mental? And my argument against this is that all experiences are actually mental. Everything that you see and you hear and you touch or you feel or whatever, these physical experiences are all filtered through the mind. And so to deny that these mental experiences are real is a fallacy, because every experience is mental. And so where the conclusion that I arrive at is that absolutely true knowledge must be true both mentally and physically. And what do I mean by that? Well, so beginning with this idea called the Principle of Correspondence, and this actually comes from an old Hermetic tradition, and it begins with the idea that the mental reality is inside the self and the physical reality is outside the self, which everyone would agree with. And then there's this idea that the mental reality is above the physical and the physical reality is below the mental. And we don't mean this as in like physically above or physically below. What we're actually talking about is in terms of reality. Like the physical reality, everything, as I said before, is filtered through the mental reality. So this mental reality is in a sense above the physical reality, because everything that's physical has to come through it. It is a super intendant, or an arbiter of all of the information that our minds can receive. And so there's this old statement that many people have heard before, is as above, so below. And I like to interpret this as a statement about the nature of true knowledge. And so some examples of true knowledge that we're all familiar with are things like geometry. It doesn't matter if it's in the physical world or if it's in your mind. A triangle always has three sides. On a flat Euclidean plane, all of the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. That's just obvious knowledge. It's true regardless of whether it's inside or outside. And of course there's also arithmetic. 1 + 1 is 2, doesn't matter if it's in the physical world or if it's within our minds. Then there's also algebra. Through transitive property, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A equals C. This is true regardless of whether it's physical or whether it's mental, so it's absolutely true. And of course there's also logical statements, like something can't be both true and false. It's either one or the other. And there are certain propositions that have to do with a system being consistent in its arguments. And that's more or less what our logic comes in. So where I start to build off of this and talking about what is understanding the physical world, or what is real in that sense, is a knowledge of material form. And so in essentialism, there's this idea that the essence of a thing is what can not be taken away without changing its identity. And take, for example, if you have a knife, if you take away the blade of a knife, all you have is a handle. The knife, or the blade of the knife, contributes to the essence of that thing, and if you take away the blade, it's no longer a knife. And then the substance refers to the physical essence of that thing, because not all essences are physical. Take, for example, beauty. There is an essence of beauty, and in a sense that you can take it away and that it would no longer be beautiful. But it's in a non-physical thing, and when we're talking about substance, we are talking about the physical things that you can actually take away. And the substance of matter is exclusively occupied space. We're talking about volume. If matter doesn't take up space exclusively, then it's not matter anymore. If you think of like a ghost passing through a wall, a ghost is immaterial because it does not exclusively occupy space. It can go through the walls. And so the form of matter is the particular shape or figure experienced either visually or tangibly. And there can be different forms to matter. If you take like a ball of clay and you can mold the ball of clay into any shape that you want, it can take on many different forms, but the substance hasn't changed. So, beginning now with talking about the uncertainty of nature, in a non-random universe, things don't act without reason and they don't react without cause. And there's no reason to believe that randomness can even exist, because it's entirely illogical. Now, the nature of a thing is observed by its inclination to act in a particular way unless obstructed or interfered with by another thing. You can think of this as Newton's second law of motion, or or even his first law of motion, these ideas that an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force, or an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by an external force. There's a certain inclination to behave in a particular way unless it's acted upon. But it can't be known if the nature of these things is constant. We can't prove that the laws of nature are not continuously changing, that just because you drop a ball now and it falls to the ground, or if you drop a ball 100 million times in a row and it falls to the ground every single time, it can't be known if the nature of that thing is changing such that at one moment in time the ball will eventually flow up. And this is not a statement about what is true. We're not saying that nature is changing, it's just there's an uncertainty to whether or not we know whether or not that change is even possible. And so this leads into some limitations with the scientific method that I've acknowledged, which is that first is that non-local state and hysteresis means that all predictions sacrifice space-time resolution and are non-deterministic in their foresight outside of highly controlled environments. And when I'm talking about non-local state, take for example, you're doing a scientific experiment and you're in your lab and it's in this highly controlled setting. You know all of the variables for this particular experiment that are within your setting. But the thing is that the speed of light is limited, as we know from general relativity, and it takes about 7 minutes for light from the sun to reach the Earth. So if the sun were to have exploded 6 minutes and 40 seconds ago, and your experiment takes 45 seconds to run, during that one run of your experiment, during the middle of that experiment, the whole sky will go dark, there will be a huge power surge, and all of these variables that you thought were constant within the setting of your experiment have now changed. And there is no way for you to have known that that change was going to occur, because you would have to have known that information faster than the speed of light travels. So this is an example of the dependence of any particular environment upon known local state. And there's another example of this as well. Like, say, for example, if you built a trebuchet and you could calculate with absolute precision that this projectile was going to land in this particular location. Well, you fire the trebuchet and the wind happens to blow as it's in the air and it gets blown off course and lands in a different direction. Now, the reason why the experiment did not happen exactly as you predicted it would was because you couldn't calculate that the wind was going to blow in that particular direction. And this example right here is also an example of hysteresis, because hysteresis is when the effects of something become very distant from their causes. And this happens with chaotic systems like weather, where very small changes in its input can result in very large changes in its output. And so these systems are very complicated and very hard to predict and can really only be done in probabilities. And so whenever we're talking about any particular experiment, we're always sacrificing some resolution of space. We're eliminating all of these certain variables and focusing on a very small set of them. And even if we could, say for example we had a machine that had infinite amounts of memory and it could calculate with absolute precision all of these different variables through the large vastness of space, we would still have to do it faster than the universe itself does the calculation in order to make a prediction with 100% absolute certainty. And so in a sense all of our experiments were also sacrificing resolution of time. And so conclusively all of our experiments are going to be controlled, and the future is non-deterministic. Now, the second problem that's a limitation with the scientific method is that explaining the origins of the physical universe requires invocation of the supernatural. And when I say this, what I'm talking about is hypothetical and non-reproducible conditions where one or more natural laws are broken or changed. And empirically, such conditions are only found in the mental reality. One example of this type of condition is a scientific theory called leptogenesis. And it's this idea that under the conditions of the Big Bang, where there is this really, really high temperature, really, really high density, that the Higgs field, which actually what creates the effect of mass, breaks down. And so you end up with this entirely different laws of physics. And they had to create this hypothetical situation in order to explain why there's more matter in the universe than there is antimatter. But the thing is like if you step back and look at this objectively, it's actually unscientific, because you've created a condition which is untestable and is entirely hypothetical, it's non-reproducible, and it's also supernatural because it defies the laws of nature as we know them to be. And this just happens to be a truth of any origin of nature. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. And so the ideas of non-determinism also leads into this idea of something called the Janus Point, and which is that the universe is deterministic in hindsight, but non-deterministic in foresight. And empirically, the only moment that can be proven to exist actually is the present. You can't prove that you didn't just come into existence right now, and that every single thing that you know and every memory that you have wasn't immediately just spontaneously generated a moment ago. And this is kind of related to a old philosophical idea of something called the Boltzmann brain, about the possibility of the universe actually just being senses being randomly generated into a brain that's just floating in the abyss, versus appearing by any other form of origin. And there's also this idea that causality is dependence. It's not precedence. If you have two people that enter a room, one after the other, the second person entering the room was actually not dependent upon the first person entering the room. There's a precedence there, but there's not a dependence there. And so dependence is the essence of causality. And when it comes to action and reaction, action through reason is dependence upon a potential future state. And what I mean by this is, say for example that I need to buy bread, right? So I make plans that I'm going to head to the store today. Well, the fact that I have made plans based on this potential future state is also going to affect all of the decisions that I'm going to make between now and then. And so the actions of the present are actually dependent upon these potential future states. And this is a more involved kind of situation where I'm considering a self-consciousness, but there's also certain types of ways in which things that react where they expect a particular future state. Just trying to think of a really good example of this as well that might have occurred in nature. Like trees. Say, for example, trees. If you look at a forest, you run into why trees are so tall. Well, the reasons why they're so tall is they actually try to grow towards where the sunlight is at. So they're seeking out a potential future state, and that actually drives the way that they act now. And it's not so much as being dependent upon prior states. Like the fact that they grew in this particular area and they grew well doesn't necessarily mean that growing in another particular way is going to, or continuing to grow in that particular way is actually going to be beneficial. So action through reason is dependence upon a potential future state. So this actually breaks this idea of causality being entirely from past to present, because it actually does happen to be the case that the future affects the present just as much as the past. And so this leads into another topic of something called knowledge of material being. And so when we realize that everything is able to act with reason, is able to react based on the causes of, in the environment caused by other beings, when we're talking about beings, we're actually talking about these discrete, composable existences in time, not as in an intelligent sense. But think of it as like a particle of consciousness. It's not a system unto itself where it can have its own particular memory, but it also is introspective. And these beings actually animate the forms of things. And so all of the forms of things are in a perpetual state of becoming other forms. Rocks are becoming sand, students are becoming engineers. Everything in nature is becoming something else. And this is the nature of time, so to speak, the relative becoming of things. And so, in summary, rationalism is predicated on empiricism. The denial of the mental reality is a fallacy. Universal and absolute knowledge is true both mentally and physically, and things can only be observed as they are, not as they were or will be. The future is non-deterministic. And so that's the core of my argument, and thank you for watching.